CSV. The door swung open and two people met for the very first time. One hand reached forward while the mind behind it raced to form an opinion. The woman's face remained polite, but her thoughts already circled around a single quiet word: cold. She noticed his brief smile, the way he looked past her shoulder, and the slightly stiff way he stood. She did not hear his exact words because her brain was too busy finishing the story it had just started. That night, she described him to a friend as distant and untrustworthy, someone to avoid on the next project. Weeks later, he sent a thoughtful note about her work, but her memory of that first handshake still painted the truth. She read the note, paused for a second, and then dismissed it as office politeness that did not match the real man. The real man, she felt certain, had already revealed himself in those opening seconds of their meeting. Here is the question that hangs over every introduction. How does a mind build such a solid judgment from a single glance? Why do first impressions feel more permanent than later evidence that points in the opposite direction? The obvious answer is that first impressions capture something genuine about a person's character while their guard is still down. Most of us grow up believing that a quick look can read a stranger's true nature like a shortcut through the effort of getting to know them. Psychologists call this a first impression, the rapid evaluation we form when we first encounter someone new. It can emerge faster than it takes to say hello, sometimes flickering into awareness in less than half a second. What makes this explanation incomplete is that our swift judgments do not simply fade when contradicted. They often grow stronger, gathering their own supporting evidence while quietly filtering out anything that does not fit. Think of the woman meeting her new colleague and how the friendly note meant less to her than a single stiff posture did. Her mind treated the very first thin slice of his behavior as the clearest signal and everything else as noise. A thin slice is exactly what it sounds like, a tiny glimpse of a person's expression, movement, or tone of voice. In a famous experiment, participants watched silent 10-second video clips of college instructors and then rated their effectiveness. Their ratings closely matched the evaluations from real students who had spent an entire semester in the instructors' classrooms. Such findings suggest that a sliver of behavior can carry meaningful information about traits like confidence or warmth. But the problem arises when we confuse a meaningful sliver with a complete and unchanging portrait of a whole person. The woman believed the stiffness meant permanent coldness, not a moment of fatigue, shyness, or distraction. She felt she had captured his essence, yet what she had captured was a single frame from a long and unrehearsed film. The first turn in our story is this. The label first impression does nothing to explain why the judgment refuses to update. A name for a pattern can make it feel acceptable without ever making it more accurate in the long run. That woman kept treating her colleague with a slight guarded edge because her initial verdict had already closed the case. He sensed the guardedness, felt subtly rejected, and began to pull back further in future conversations. His pulling back looked to her like more proof of a distant personality, and the cycle tightened with every polite exchange. At this point, you might believe the mistake lies entirely in a stubborn refusal to change one's mind. But the machinery of first impressions does something more active than stubbornness. It reshapes what we actually see. When researchers showed people a series of words describing a stranger, the earliest traits on the list dominated everything that followed. If the list began with intelligent and generous, later listeners heard evidence of a warm and capable person even when negative words appeared. If the same list began with envious and stubborn, the exact same later positive words got twisted into a less flattering picture. This is called the primacy effect, and it means early information weighs heavier on the mind than later information of equal quality. Primacy is not about fairness. It is about how the brain saves energy by locking in a story early and editing lightly afterward. But editing lightly is not the same as editing accurately, and this is where the hidden cost begins to surface. Once the brain locks in cold and distant, it unconsciously searches for every detail that supports that label while softening evidence that contradicts it. The friendly note looked to the woman like a strategic move rather than sincere appreciation, and her search stopped there. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, and it transforms a first impression from a guess into a self-sustaining belief. Confirmation bias is like a guard at a gate who only lets in travelers wearing the same color as the people already inside. It does not feel like bias from the inside. It feels like careful observation finally seeing through the polite surface. The woman would have described herself as perceptive, and the evidence she noticed certainly supported that feeling. She never had to wonder whether her own behavior might have changed the very evidence she was gathering. This brings us to the second major turn, because first impressions do not merely sit inside our heads and echo. They leak out through small actions, tone of voice, eye contact, and the warmth or distance we offer another person. When the woman acted guarded toward her colleague, her own coldness became part of his environment before he could even speak. He read her body language, felt the tightness, and responded with a shorter reply than he had originally intended. His shorter reply looked to her like tightness of his own, confirming the very aloofness she had first glimpsed in the doorway. Behavioral scientists refer to this loop as a self-fulfilling prophecy, where an expectation produces the very outcome it predicts. It is not magic. It is a simple chain of cause and effect running through ordinary social signals. When interviewers expected the candidate to be cold, they sat farther back and asked sharper questions, making the candidate appear more guarded and distant. The personality the interviewer saw was partly a reflection of the climate the interviewer had unknowingly created. Now return to the woman and her colleague and notice how the story of their first impression looks different under this light. She believed she had accurately detected his true nature, but she had also quietly invited the behavior that proved her right. He might have been guarded that first day because he had not slept, or because he felt anxious in a new role, or because he was simply shy. Judgment turned a temporary state into a fixed label, and her own reactions made that label stick harder than glue. This is the moment where the comfortable wisdom about first impressions begins to crack open. We are not passive cameras faithfully recording the personality we meet. We are active players co-creating the scene from the first handshake. The reversal sits right here. The feeling that a first impression is accurate may come from the fact that we helped make it accurate. Yet, none of this means that first impressions are useless or that we should never trust our quick readings of a room. In situations of genuine threat, a fast judgment about someone's intentions can keep us safe in ways that slow deliberation cannot. The thin slice that picks up anger, aggression, or dishonesty can serve as an early warning system shaped by a long history of survival. It fires when we meet a quiet child and label them unfriendly, or a shy colleague and decide they lack leadership potential. The cost of the first impression habit is not that it is wrong every time, but that it rarely checks its own homework. And when the homework does arrive, in the form of a kind message or a warm gesture, the mind is often too proud to regrade the exam. What changes if we understand the self-fulfilling nature of early judgments? It opens a small pause between the automatic verdict and the next action we take toward another human being. That pause is the space where a first impression can remain a useful hypothesis instead of hardening into a final verdict. Now step back into the doorway where the two strangers first met and watch the scene happen with new eyes. The handshake, the brief smile, the eyes that looked past her shoulder. All of it was real, but none of it was the whole story. The story was still unwritten, and the pen was in both of their hands, not just in the observer's silent reading. The cold label had never belonged to him alone. It had grown between them like a shadow cast by a light she did not know she was holding. This is the central insight that answers the question we raised at the beginning about why first impressions outlast evidence. They endure not because they capture a permanent hidden truth, but because they create patterns of interaction that look exactly like proof. You do not need to blame yourself for every quick judgment that rises without warning, because those judgments arrive from older, faster brain pathways. But you can learn to treat a first impression as a first draft rather than a published review. A first draft can be revisited, revised, or even quietly set aside once a clearer picture comes into focus. The climax of this exploration is not that we should ignore our gut feelings, but that we should recognize when our gut is also picking up echoes of our own expectations. After the woman realized that her guardedness might have helped create his distance, she began to leave a little more room for different evidence. She did not force herself to like him. She simply stopped treating her first impression as the only possible interpretation of his character. In the weeks that followed, she noticed small behaviors she had previously dismissed: offers to help, a remembered detail about her weekend, a patient explanation. None of it erased the stiff first moment, but it added new sentences to a story that had been stuck on page 1. Psychologists who study person perception often say that getting to know someone is less like taking a photograph and more like slowly painting a portrait. You add new strokes and colors over time, and the picture can shift in ways that a snapshot never would. A photograph freezes a single instant and mistakes it for forever, while a painting acknowledges that seeing another person is always an active, ongoing process. First impressions are loud because they come first, but loudness is not the same as truth, and firstness is not the same as completeness. The brain prefers a clean story to a messy one, which is why it rushes to fill gaps with guesses that feel like facts. Understanding this does not mean you will never form another snap judgment, because every brain on the planet forms them automatically. It means you can notice the judgment rise and then ask yourself one small, clarifying question before your next sentence escapes. The question is simply, what else might be going on here that my first glance could not possibly show me? That question does not erase your impression, but it does give the other person room to become more than the label you assigned before they said a word. Now return one last time to the handshake, the door, and the two strangers whose story began in a few silent seconds. The coldness she felt was real in that moment, but the mistake was believing that a moment was the same thing as a permanent truth.